Welcome to our dinner program on autonomous societies and encoding bias. For those of you I have not had the pleasure of meeting yet, I'm Sean Kanuck, one of the co-chairs of Sci-Fi, and I have the great pleasure of speaking with a wonderful panel of women tonight. Sci-Fi brings you another anti-manel, which we are very proud of. So please, those of you in line, please do continue getting your food. Those of you already seated, enjoy your dinner. But we're going to start the dinner theater for you. Our group, we have, and you've switched orders, so I'm just going to read them from here, ladies. With us tonight, we have Megha Arora, a data scientist from Palantir Technologies. We have Hanan Salam, co-founder of Women in AI. We have Abeba Birhane, who's a cognitive scientist researcher at the University of Dublin. We have Eileen Fuchs, who's with the Federal Ministry of the Interior, Building and Community in Germany. And we have Trisha, one of our fellows from Observer Research Foundation. So the framing questions that we posed to our panelists when they agreed to join us were about AI systems that can be functionally efficient, but possibly not socially optimal. We're going to be talking about encoding bias, including efforts to use bias to promote equality, rather than just entrenching incumbent views or power dynamics. We also want to ask the question of why should machines address or rectify human biases. Those are some of the themes we want to seed in your mind as we get started here. We're going to spend about 30 minutes learning from our panelists, encouraging them to engage each other, and then we're going to try to save close to 30 minutes to invite all of you to share your thoughts and engage the panelists as well. I know we've had a long, full, and exciting day already, so we want to keep this fairly informal and enjoyable and engaging for all of you as well. As I told the panelists, the less I talk, that means the better the event went. And I'm really excited. I've been doing some teaching in the United States on the security implications of AI and recently written a little on the ethics of AI. So I'm quite frankly learning to hear from all of you and expand my own thinking on the topics that I've just started researching. So thank you all for joining us. And I guess I'd like to kick off by getting a sense of the AI landscape. I know that not everyone in the room may be specialists in this area or studying it. So my hope was that we could start with Megha and Abeba and get both a little bit of the sense of the technology and where we're at today, and then also understand some of the key themes, why bias may be unavoidable, or other things in your work that you're seeing as pressing. So would one of you care to kick us off?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, ORF, Sci-Fi. Very excited to be a part of this conversation. I would let Abeba dig deeper into the tech and try to get us started with more generally understanding, as Sean mentioned, the AI landscape. I want to first emphasize on the fact that bias is a very overloaded term. It's intrinsically quite complex. If data was all random and chaotic, then it would be quite useless, right? Data mimics how the world functions, and this data is rightly expected to have some skew or bias. The world has historically been and continues to be imperfect. We have seen multiple examples where a subsection of the population received unfair treatment. So real-world data sets are also imperfect. When we try to build autonomous societies on top of big data, we introduce additional problems. This is where machine learning, AI enters the picture. First, it's critical to understand that we can neither capture all the data in the world, nor can we record all the context around it. The collection process itself, more often than not, has flaws, which is often referred to as sampling or measurement bias. Secondly, ML models, essentially predictive analytics of any kind, is bound to be controversial because these models are being built by data scientists. who have their own selective biases, right? All human beings do. And they're so far from the context in which these models are often deployed. Moreover, it's highly likely that these models are being built on top of biased data. Both desirable and undesirable kind of bias, desirable meaning the trends we actually want these models to capture, and undesirable bias, as I mentioned, historical discriminatory context, right? So what happens as a result of these two phenomena is that societies have problems, and now through these clever algorithms, which lack context because we never gave it to them, we have systematically amplified these problems. The scale argument cannot be ignored here. A computer can decide in a fraction of a second whether to give out a loan to someone or not, whereas a human being would take a few minutes to parse a loan application. So the severity being introduced by the automation piece cannot be ignored. This calls for remediation in societies, in data that represent them, and within models that are being built on top of these data sets. But correction is extremely hard. Equity is not the same as equal treatment or opportunity, and not all actions that might get us closer to any one of the two can be justified ethically or in court of law. One classic example here is affirmative action in the US. The gist is that even if we know the exact nature of the bias, how to legitimately or reasonably fix it is still an open problem. It's far from clear what's fair. There are more than 70 different fairness metrics which are defined in academic literature alone. In the pre-AI era, when we primarily tried to tackle these issues through policy, we were struggling because it is a hard problem. Now, if we jump the gun and if we build autonomous societies on top of biased data sets and then try to dissect and fix the problem, the ramifications of the process will be very unjust. What I'm trying to get to here is that the solution, I feel, has to be ingrained in the process of building autonomous societies, and much more importantly, the actual fixing comes later. Bias discovery is the first step, and then bias mitigation follows. On that note, I will let Abeba dig deeper on the tech piece here.
Cool. Thank you. Hi. So to get into the deeper technicalities of AI, I won't get too deep. But I just want to ask everybody a question. So when you think of AI, do you think of like self-driving cars and shiny robots? Hands up if you do. I know you are eating, but... Okay. You are not confirming my bias, which is unfortunate. But I think there is a huge misconception that when we think of AI, we think of these autonomous systems as if they exist, without a human in the loop by themselves. But putting that misconception aside, AI for me is ubiquitous, as you heard throughout the day and yesterday, through the panels, through the keynotes. It's ubiquitous, it's everywhere. It's in the social sphere, it's in our everyday lives. It's your Alexa, your smart home, or the face recognition camera that captures your image, whether you are aware of it or not. That is AI. AI is not something that's waiting to happen. That's futuristic. It's invisible. It's really integrating into whether it's banking, whether it's social welfare, whether it's policing, especially in the States. So when we think of AI and when we think of bias in AI, I think that should be the central focus. So the first thing to shift this thinking of AI from these futuristic, waiting to happen scenarios into the realistic, into what's happening now. Again, when we think of AI, we think of this autonomous machine that makes decisions, that operates by itself. There is nothing. We don't have that. I don't know if we will have that in the future. I remain very skeptical. But for now, there always is a person, there always is a programmer, there always is an engineer making decisions, starting from what kind of data to collect, what kind of questions to ask, what kind of problems to solve. So when we are discussing AI and bias, we have to continually think about the people behind collecting data, behind building these AI systems, and their world of view, their understanding, because bias necessarily springs from how they capture the world, and it's not inseparable from the people behind it. So that's my one important point, I think. I'll pass it on to someone else.
Well, thank you very much for kicking us off, ladies, and I think you've given a really good introduction to the important points we're going to be discussing further here. You know, as they alluded, you hear conversations about the robots taking over the world or superintelligence. Most technologists in Silicon Valley, where you work, and other research universities will tell you what you really have today is expert systems and machine learning for specific tasks, and there are human engineers involved. A great example from earlier this year, Microsoft refused to complete a contract with a California law enforcement jurisdiction because the company was afraid its facial recognition and AI programs would create biased results that would lead to the stopping and examination indiscriminately of females and certain minorities. And the problem was the algorithm itself was doing what it had been trained to do. It had trained on biased law enforcement data. So you saw the human bias get put into the machine. That's one aspect of this possibly. So the issue of ethics is hugely important, especially in public policy. And I'd like to come to you, Eileen, if I can, because my understanding is your government is about to come out with a data ethics commission report on some of these issues about doing risk assessments, liability, and audits. So can you tell us a little bit more of how Germany is looking at these issues?
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot for being on this panel. I'm very excited. My first time at Sci-Fi. So,
Welcome.
thanks. Well, I think that the issue of data ethics is, of course, we're not the first ones to examine it. The European Union and the Commission instated the high-level expert group on AI. And they published their report in April, which is, of course, partly what the Data Ethics Commission in Germany is working on, which was instated last year, an independent commission of experts and academics, but also people from business, people working in AI. And they have comprised a very comprehensive report of, I think, nearly 200 pages, which of course has a summary, and which will be published on 23rd of October, also in short in English. So what you said before, Abeba, and also Megha, is that AI systems or algorithmic systems, as the Data Ethics Commission calls them, are actually very deeply rooted in our society. So everything that goes into them is actually mirrors our society, even if we're not consciously thinking about it. So what the Data Ethics Commission basically tries to establish is a system of, let's put it like that, criticality of algorithmic systems. And I can deliberate later in more detail. The essence is the more critical a system, an AI system is, the more regulation should apply to it. And the principles that should be respected when creating algorithms, and the creator is responsible for seeing that these principles are put in place, are basically the ones that the European high-level group has in their report summarized as 7 principles: human agency and oversight, transparency, privacy and data governance, diversity and non-discrimination, and fairness, accountability, liability, and societal and environmental well-being. I think one that actually is added by the Data Ethics Commission, the German one, is the concept of explainability. So a lot of their work was is also focusing on make AI explainable to the persons affected, which can, in essence, involve very expert deliberations, but it can also be in form of pictograms or simple language. So transparency, explainability, and accountability are, I guess, the three key options or principles that need to be respected in creating AI. That's one of their key recommendations. And the more critical a system, the harder the regulatory measures apply. So let's put it like this. If you have an algorithm that is just assisting humans in making decisions, like a doctor who needs to make a diagnosis, then perhaps the criticality of the system is not so high if he still has his own diagnosis and experience and can say, oh, I know the system says it's something that is very common in male whites, but actually this is a woman and she's African and has perhaps a different background, and in my experience it's something else, and I look in another place. So the criticality is not so high as, for example, in self-driving cars, which make decisions by themselves. So the measures can vary from just making the system transparent, that would be quite low level, to perhaps impact assessments, which would be for stage 2 critical systems, up to monitoring, even monitoring via a live port. And even in the utmost case, if you have an unjustifiable bias, that is, or an unethical decision made by an automated system where no human can interfere anymore, that would have to be banned. So this is kind of the core system they have worked out for regulating bias in algorithmic systems. And I think it's a very interesting topic to talk about because it actually, what comes from it is a system of accountability. And the question is, who is in charge of seeing that this is met? And you have to create institutions and perhaps hold existing institutions accountable to monitor this. And I think this then opens a whole new world of checks and balances.
I know it hasn't come out yet, so we're probably jumping the shark, as we would say in American English. But is the German view more likely to hold the programmers or creators of the algorithm liable, or the entity that implements it and puts it into a product or a service? Is there any discussion on that yet?
Well, I guess you're one of the first to hear of this report at all. Since it's an independent commission, the government still has to decide what to do with the report. So it's an advisory function they have. In my personal opinion, both options are possible. I would rather see it as I personally would rather see it as the responsibility of the institution that kind of has commissioned an algorithm to do something. So I guess the person or the institution who sets the goal of an algorithm has to take responsibility. But I mean, liability liability law is very complex. So I think there will be solutions that can be applicable to that. I don't think that's the core issue at hand.
All right, thank you very much. So we've started talking about these very high-tech solutions and some of the concerns that come with them. There are also voices out there asking, are we over-technologizing? Are there possibly other low-tech options that can achieve some of these functions without introducing these concerns? Sometimes it's phrased as, the medium is the message. So I'd like to invite Hanan to share her thoughts with us, but before you tackle that issue, could you tell us a little bit about women in AI and what you're doing in that effort?
Thank you, Sean. Yeah, so just to present myself, I'm the co-founder of Women in AI, which is a nonprofit working to increase the participation and the representation of women in the field of artificial intelligence. So we are doing this through several axes. First of all, education, where we are focusing on young girls to increase their interest in the field of artificial intelligence through workshops of introduction and also orientation towards the career paths of AI. Research, where we try to work in partnership with research centers on bias in artificial intelligence, as well as speakers curation, where we push women speakers to speak on stage to become role models. And finally, content creation, where we also push women AI experts to create content on AI to also become role models. So this is it. If you are a woman or a man interested in this, join us. You are very welcome. So about your question, low-tech solutions for bias. Yeah, so low-tech solutions are definitely possible. One way to fight bias in AI is to ensure a diverse team. So because having a diverse team working on the development of AI systems and development of AI models will probably be very helpful in solving bias from its roots without the necessity of having high-tech solutions. So let me give you an example of that. When sexual harassment, assistants, virtual assistants such as Cortana and Siri and Alexa were tested for sexual harassment, surprisingly, their response to sexual harassment was by throwing jokes and being very flirty. So it is not sure the number of women and men that were behind this development, but it is really clear that this is a design problem. The people that were behind the conception of these assistants or bots are more probably men who have decided that it is better to respond to sexual harassment with jokes or with flirting rather than being direct and in a serious manner. So this is a clear bias and prejudice problem that is transmitted from men to the AI solutions through bots. So having more women in AI would be probably and hopefully a way to delete these kind of biases from AI solutions, because we will be taking into account everybody's point of view in the design system. And this is what we are doing in Women in AI, actually, where we are working through different axes to increase the participation of women in the design and in the implementation of artificial intelligence systems. And I would just want to add that, in my opinion, perhaps the solution is not just low-tech or high-tech. I think maybe it is a mix of both, because we all agree that the databases that exist in the private or in the public sector are biased. So in addition to having a diverse team, it is very important to ensure that the data that we are using to train our AI models are non-biased, as well as it is very important to work on high-tech and research solutions in order to search for bias in the algorithms or in the data, as well as prevent them. And this can only happen if we have a multidisciplinary team that is composed of policymakers, social scientists, computer scientists, AI experts, and law experts in law, etc. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So thus far, we've been talking about bias in AI systems as a bad thing, and that's usually the context in which we want to be addressing it. However, one of our researchers at ORF, Trish, who joins us on stage, in her September 2019 issue brief, one of the points you brought out was an argument in defense of bias in AI. Can you tell us a little more about when and why we might want bias in AI?
Sure. So I'm going to focus my response to that around three sets of interlinked points, which relate to diversity, bias, and something Megha alluded to, which is equity versus inequality. First point, if we think that bias is something new or something just new to technology that we are only starting to see because of AI, I invite you to consider the example of the Kodak Shirley cards. Shirley cards were what photographers used for decades to calibrate contrast, brightness, color tones in their photographs. The problem with it, the sample of the Shirley card was a white woman. So you had, as a result, a sort of inadvertent bias that crept into something as simple as photography. Another example is, say, the air conditioning in this room, which to the men in this room might feel like a nice, pleasant temperature, but for the women in this room, this is basically the Arctic. This is not an intentional bias. This is what I mean when I say equality versus equity. The temperature is the same for all of us, but we're all perceiving it differently. Going to the point of diversity, talk of diversity these days is often embroiled in this kind of, it's just a political correctness debate, that it's just liberal snowflakes pushing a globalist agenda. No. Diversity isn't just this kind of soft issue. It's also something that feeds into the robustness of the AI you're trying to build. Diversity in programmers, as Hanan has alluded it to, in the data you're feeding into algorithms, all of this helps in building robust sets of algorithms that actually do what they set out to do. If we just ignore the existence of social hierarchies, of social bias, which is what the concept of equality essentially is, that doesn't erase the existence of these social hierarchies or these biases. And so my argument in favor of bias is that instead of pretending that technology is this, or AI can be the solution to social hierarchies because it's blind to the inequities or inequalities that exist, we should encode certain biases that promote equity. We can flip an example. For example, this is Amazon's hiring algorithm, which is a fairly well-known example in this field, which was fed decades of data on what Amazon considered their ideal candidate. And the algorithm taught itself that women were undesirable candidates because whether they intended to or not, the data being fed in were all men. So the algorithm ended up disqualifying CVs of women which had terms like women's hockey team. It's very arbitrary. To counteract that, to bring more diversity into your workforce, to bring more diversity into your data, there is a certain degree of bias that you require to uplift certain sections that are underrepresented in programming, in data, and so forth. Yeah.
So let's explore that example for another minute. If I'm hearing you correctly, and I am familiar with the case where the historical hiring patterns of Amazon were reflected in the system's results. So what would we do? Would we go find an equal number of male and female resumes of equal talent and then share that with the machine as this is the demographic we're looking for and sort of introduce a demographically equal data set to it? Is that the concept?
So that is one possible solution, but that's the equality solution to things.
Okay.
That doesn't change the existing structure of the company. You need
So where should we
more
go?
women coming
Okay.
in. So that's why I mean equity and bias. You need more women coming in to counteract the historical inequities that have already been so deeply encoded in institutions and organizations.
So again, let me continue. In the American context, at least, this sounds similar to some of the legal efforts at affirmative action that we've done in the brick and mortar world. Would that be a proper analog, or if not, is there a better description?
That's an example. India has its own sets of policies which are similar. Yes, that is one solution.
Okay, great, thank you. Again, as I said at the beginning, we want to have a lot of time to engage with the audience. but we've heard a lot of interesting issues put out on the floor from different perspectives. I'd like to give each of you the opportunity to pick up on any points you've heard from the others or address any of the questions that others took a first crack at. And again, in the bigger concept of what can we be doing to improve either the technological coding that's being done in the private sector or the policy implementation that's being in the public sector. So in no specific order, I welcome thoughts from any of you furthering the conversation on any of the topics we've already broached before we go to the audience. And this would be a good time, those of you in the audience who want to engage in the discussion, to start thinking about your questions and identifying where the microphones may be around the room. And I will also be inviting our panelists to return fire with questions of their own to the audience. So looking forward to a lively discussion. But before we get there, anyone want to follow up on anything we've already started to address? I see Eileen and then Megha.
I just want to make it short, referring to what you just said, and also what was said before by you two. I think we should see the chances that are actually presented by detecting bias through algorithms. Something actually is shown that before was obscured, so or perhaps was just something we all thought was there, but we didn't have the evidence. So it's not the algorithm's fault; it's the fault of the people who kind of feed the data in, that kind of then produce, oh, we have a bias here. So, and that actually feeds in quite well with public policy, because then public policy can say, okay, so what do we do in future to avoid this? For example, we could think about impact assessments that involve sandboxing certain algorithmic designs. So there is a whole area of work that's open and that needs to be addressed through bias being detected.
I want to take a couple of minutes to talk about bias mitigation. I think all of us have touched upon it, and I just want to tease it out a little bit more. First, from the tech side, and feel free to add to that, Abeba, that so data scientists are trying to do it. You cannot obviously go and rewrite history. That's not possible, as we've already discussed. But then what do you do? So the data scientist who's working on a machine learning model needs to care about representation. Is the data, is the predictive outcome, that is the predictive label that we are trying to predict, is that balanced in data? Is the data doing like a good job at representing all these different subsections of the population? If it is not, how do you fix it? So that's all a part of the modeling process. That's one. The other thing is just as Hanan pointed out, the data scientist should be talking to the legal team, the compliance team, trying to understand what fairness is, right? How do I decide that if this machine learning model is trying to fix something in favor of a particular subsection of the population, then this is what my definition of fairness is, which then moves into monitoring. So is that the fairness metric which I will be monitoring when this model is in production, when it is making decisions on an everyday basis? And both of these arguments, I think, would then allow me to conclude that the solution is very much end-to-end. It's not a completely technical problem. And we need to identify sources of bias at all levels, involving all stakeholders, and then try to tackle the problem.
I'll just add to that. So I agree with everybody on the panel, and your point on equities, I totally agree with. But just to add on, so you mentioned diversity in both the team that works on any automated systems or AI systems, or the diversity in data sets, great. And you mentioned the three principles of accountability, transparency, explainability, all great. They are all ways moving to a fair and a more ethical AI systems. But I want to add I want to kind of zoom out and add something to the panel. It's for a lot of computer scientists, cognitive scientists, people who work in the AI field, in the tech field, they think of bias and they think they they see unfairness, and a lot of work focuses on finding technical solutions, on finding formulas, on how to debias your data set, or how to calculate, even how to even calculate equity. But what we forget is to kind of zoom out and say, what are we actually trying to do? A lot of the algorithms we are creating are very much focused on punishing the poor, punishing the disfranchised, punishing the most vulnerable. Look at the predictive systems, the policing systems that every company, not every company, like a lot of the tech companies, including Palantir, it's nothing personal, but it's one of the hugely ethical companies, ethically charged companies. What you find is it's trying to catch who should we detain, who should we deport, who is likely to commit crime, who is likely to reoffend, how do we catch them? And the systems in the welfare system, who is cheating the welfare system? Imagine if we can flip this, and if you are thinking of what kind of society do we want to live, how about we focus on building systems? Why is this prison population, why are they likely to commit crime? What are the root causes? How do we integrate the prison population back into society? These are the starting points for an ethical solution, for an ethical AI. It's about rethinking what kind of society we want to live in, as opposed to how do we catch people, how do we punish people. So my point is kind of zooming out and thinking of more with the most vulnerable in mind, and how can we help? How do we improve society rather than how do we catch? And I think low-tech solutions is one of the solutions, because AI is one of the most overhyped fields. If there is a take for anything, whether it's governments, policymakers, academics, everybody's happy to jump on the bandwagon without even considering whether we needed this system in the first place or not. So first, we question, do we need it or not? Second, can we get away with low-tech as possible, and gather as little data as possible? That is a way for me that we protect the most vulnerable, and that's at the core of ethics.
Now we're rolling up our sleeves and addressing these really tough issues. Before I give the mic to Hanan for her comments, Palantir was mentioned, so I want to give you the chance, Megha, to discuss some of the efforts your company has underway to address some of these concerns.
Would love to. I just realized I'll have to have a much longer post-panel conversation with Abeba, trying to explain what Palantir does, but you'd actually be surprised to know that this is exactly the mode of my work. Like, trying to figure out at the problem cherry-picking bit, what are the problems we are trying to invest in, not trying to over-engineer the tech, not trying to improve the fairness metric, which we don't even know what fairness would mean, of a machine learning model out there, but like trying to engage with the companies, with deployments. And when I say Palantir deployments, I am referring to every industry, not just governments. This is pharma, this is healthcare, manufacturing, working with human, like HR teams, so very much impacting the employees at these deployments. And Paula, my colleague, is also here, and she is extremely forward deployed, as in talking to these deployments, talking to these customers, trying to get context from the ground. And all of that goes into the kind of problems Palantir decides to work, and the problems my team focuses on, which is privacy and civil liberties. I don't want to digress from the conversation here for the benefit of the audience, but very happy. Yeah, sorry.
I just want to finish, if that's okay.
Yeah, for sure.
You finished? Okay. So you are a great person. Paula, I also attended your panel earlier. I have no doubt you are doing brilliant work as individual person. But, and I don't take you to represent Palantir itself. Or if you represent Palantir, I have no doubt you are trying to do a good job from the inside. But as far as Palantir goes, I think I very much have problems with big tech, including Facebook, Google. Palantir goes even further than these big techs. So I have a note here. Palantir itself admitted of discrimination in 2007, and they paid $1.7 million in a lawsuit against the Department of Labor in the States. Palantir works with ICE. Their technology is used to detect and to export immigrants into the States. So the point I'm trying to make is these are the things we need to notice. These are the things we need to bring to the fore and discuss if we want to not just ethically wash. This is a term I think the tech ethics coined. Ethic wash is the idea of appearing as if you are ethical and you care about ethics, whereas on the other hand, what you do is the opposite of being ethical. So if we want to actually do some ethical work and not just do ethics wash, we need to talk about the likes of Palantir and what they stand for.
Oh, well, we certainly appreciate the conviction of your sentiment and the objective of your work. Obviously, Palantir does do work with governments and other entities. I think that's well known. And if I heard you correctly, the case you cited was from 2007. So I would just say personally, I think there may have been a lot of development since then. But in a general sense, I think the point is well taken. We need to look at what governments and technology companies are doing in the area. If I may, I'd like to continue the discussion on the other themes, but I thank you both for sharing the viewpoints from your positions. And I hope that discussion continues robustly during cocktails later tonight and the rest of the conference tomorrow. But I want to give Hanan a chance to offer a few comments, and then those of you who do have questions, please proceed to one of the microphones because we'll be going to you next.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. So I just want to comment on Trisha's, like what you said about we need bias. What I understood of what you said is that you think we should hire a woman in a position just because she's a woman. Is that correct? I mean, if this is what you mean, I think there's a problem because if we do that, we might end up hiring incompetent people. But then I want to just link with what Abeba said about like finding the problem and working on the problem, like finding the solution of the problem. Yes, we don't have enough women in tech or in AI. The solution is not to like hire more women just because they are women. The solution is, yeah, there is a problem. Women are not interested in tech. Women are not doing engineering. Not a lot of women are. Because when women are young, they are not oriented toward this path by default. We are told, for example, I don't know, you have to get married, better to have a job that is, I don't know, easier, I don't know, lots of cultural stuff. And so we end up of less women in the tech industry or in AI, etc. And so to work on that, to have more women in this field on participating in the economy or leaders, we start by educating them, by increasing their interest, by solving these cultural, like tackling these cultural problems, until we arrive like in long term, 20, 50, or 100 years, to a society where, yeah, everybody has equal opportunities, or like they know what their true opportunities are, and then they follow these opportunities, not according to what the society thinks, but what they really like and like can offer to this society. So this is just my comment. If you would like to respond.
Point completely taken. Yes, the problem of bias is more than just, you can't just solve it by hiring more women for the sake of being women. It's a deeper social issue, and education definitely plays into it. However, I will push back a little on that, because having a conscious effort to hire more women leads hiring teams to pay more attention to resumes they would have otherwise overlooked because of an unconscious bias.
Well, we promised you an informative and energized discussion. I think we're well on our way, and I can think of no one better to add to it than ORF President Samir Saran. So first question to you, sir.
I'm fascinated by this conversation, and I was just being a little mischievous by perhaps suggesting that should we take a lesson or leaf out of the book written by those who manipulate and influence elections, change user-consumer behavior, change choices and preferences, who do this on a daily basis for marketing companies, for retail companies, even for political parties. And perhaps, is it time to consider the idea of synthetic data being put into the feed? So you create data sets that change certain outcomes. And is that something that is already being practiced? Because I'm not from this sector, so I don't really know too much about it. So one is the idea of synthetic data, create false data sets to get certain outcomes. That's one question. And the second is that even though algorithms discover bias, and I think Eileen has touched on it, that we have to use them more as a way of learning and as a feedback loop, is there a danger that the biases they discover are biased themselves? And in a sense, they still work within frameworks which do not see perverse outcomes because the societal and cultural contexts don't see them as perverse. And how do you adjust this when you make these same algorithms polysemic or universal across the world? So cultural contexts are different. Algorithms will work with different efficiencies in different communities. How do you, I'm just complicating it because I thought this is a panel that can engage with it. Sorry, so it was a long one.
So I think you've got two issues packed in there. The first is synthetic data, which in my interpretation can not only mean fabricated data itself, but statistically disproportionate data that could be put into systems, even though the underlying data points might actually be accurate. And then the second issue of meta-level biases. So anyone like to take on either or both of those? Eileen, I know you were mentioned. I'm happy to start with you if you want.
Sure. Yeah, on the meta bias level, I think it's absolutely correct. We live in a framework of rules, obligations, societal customs that can never be fully overridden. But I think that societies develop. So I think the values change. Like, for example, in Ireland, Abeba, you know, we lived there. It was divorce was not possible 15 years ago. There was no gay marriage. Now both is suddenly there, and it's absolutely accepted. So and Leo Varadkar is openly gay. So it's an absolute unthinkable. It was unthinkable. My mother's from Ireland. It was unthinkable when she left in the 70s. So societies evolve, and that needs to be reflected when we talk about procedures to test algorithmic systems, to evaluate them in impact assessments. And I think the diversity and multidisciplinary approach that Hanan actually brought into the discussion is key here. I think we really need multidisciplinary teams in creating algorithms, systems, in creating AI, and that will over time reflect societal change and change in values. And I think, of course, it can never be fully eliminated, and I don't think that's even desirable.
I'll take a stab at the synthetic data point which Samir mentioned. The answer actually very beautifully lies in the question itself, which is that if you are trying to use synthetic data and you wanted to solve a predictive outcome problem, right? Which means that the first thing you'll think about is how would you generate that data to cater to the same problem. And you'll be surprised to know that a lot of advanced and sophisticated synthetic data generation approaches involve machine learning. Because the idea is that how do you capture insights from this data, which the synthetic data set which will encapsulate. Which again gets us to one of the things I talked about earlier, which is desirable bias and undesirable bias. How do you now let this machine learning technique filter out what are the trends to learn and encapsulate in the synthetic data and what not to keep, right? And then if there was bias in terms of one particular segment of the population being underrepresented in the original data set, then this would either be outliers, which your synthetic data set, again, will not generalize well or not capture fully. And then the problem essentially then becomes the same. Then how would you figure out the synthetic data set which you ended up with has bias or not, and then how would you cater to it?
So on the synthetic data question, this isn't linked to bias, but that might actually be a very interesting solution for the privacy issue, because you're not compromising the data of people who would be affected in case of a breach. But synthetic data is actually a very neatly packaged solution.
Thank you. We're going to go to a question from the next gentleman there. From my vantage point, I can only see one microphone. If there's another microphone and people are behind a pillar, I can't see you. So we'll go to this gentleman, and then I do believe we have someone back there who I can't see. Okay, sir?
Yeah, so from the question of Mr. Samir, like as a technical person in machine learning, I know that even the synthetic data is also, like it is used, like to generate synthetic data, we have to use the real data. And the issue currently we are facing is that the real data is biased. So if we are also again generating that synthetic data, then it is also like not very correct. So in this kind of field, I think we need human intervention, like at least. And one of my main question was with Mrs. Megha, like we have talked about how should we remove bias and all. Like what actually, because you are a data scientist, so what actually are you doing to remove bias in your company? Like what is the reality?
When you say remove bias in my company, you
Like,
mean for internal Palantir workflows, or because Palantir is a B2B company, so we work with other companies, or in their data sets?
Like in their data sets, right?
Okay. I can give you an example. I was actually working with a bank recently on a loan propensity use case. So basically deciding whether an individual should be granted a loan or not and what's beneficial for the bank. You can imagine the problem itself has serious fairness implications. And what these very thoughtful data scientists were doing on the ground is that they were very aware of the bias problem, and they were very concerned that the protected attributes in the data set, which is gender, nationality, all these, everything which would essentially be called PI, personally identifiable information, they said, oh, this can be the source for bias. Let's just drop these columns, and they thought that that essentially fixes the problem. What happens is, because, as again I said, the world's not random. It's not random chaos. There's like systems out there, and that's what your data sets mimic. There are correlations within these columns. So there are data proxies which will capture the bias even if you drop these original columns, right? So dropping the columns actually was not helping. So one of the solutions I built out with them is that it's essential to keep the source of bias in the data set, because that gives you the opportunity then to handle it downstream, which is what even Trisha alluded to earlier. And then you work with the legal and compliance team, as I said, to figure out what is the correction measure here. Does it make sense? And is the correction measure one time? Or is it something which you want to continuously monitor and track? How do you establish the feedback loop? How do you get context into the picture? So now you have like a loan propensity model, but this is going to be deployed in an outside world. This bank's going to run campaigns. The campaigns are going to be executed at a branch level. Every branch is going to operate differently. So there's bias also at the very end step. So if you want to now get data every 3 months as an outcome of these campaigns and retrain these models, do you see how much context there is to capture so as to make sure that every future iteration of this model which you're building is less and less biased, or if it is biased, it is the kind of bias you want to keep? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I was just giving you like a real world example of how I would think about this problem.
Okay. Okay, so like my next question was like, in terms like, sometimes we have the data, but we have the correct data, like in a binary classification problem, like we have to predict a dog or cat, like very simple. So in that case also, if we have more images of dog as compared to cats, then definitely it will be biased towards dogs. So what in that case, if we have a less captured data? Because in previously we were talking about biased data at all, like in every label. So in this case, because we don't have much data also, so like even there is no mistake, like the few pictures of cat on which we are training is also correct, but still it is less. So in that cases, what can we do?
Yeah, who would like to address limited data sets?
If anybody else wants to take that.
Like
Okay.
no
Yeah.
issues if it's
No, I
getting
think
long.
actually
Okay.
this one is way simpler from a technical perspective. There are machine learning models out there which you can tune based on whether the class representation is balanced or not. Right? So there can be, it might be the case that the final model you end up with is less tolerant towards noise if you would give it cat images, but it's not the case that the model will be completely biased. And if the original data set had like 65% dogs and 35% cats, that's also the outcome the model will predict for test set. Or like the proportion would remain the same. Machine learning has become more advanced than that.
Okay. Okay then. Thanks.
Do we have other questions from the audience? Otherwise, I'm going to invite. Oh, we have one. Please.
Maybe I really don't want to stand on the way of the drinks because I also enjoyed them. I just had one. I came short from being totally satisfied by something, Trisha, you said, and I think Hanan was trying to follow up on that. Is the issue of how we address bias by bringing in more diversity. And the question she was asking, I think, is it enough to bring in women, for example? I want to follow up on that because I think this is a debate we've had in various contexts, including in countries where women or minorities are marginalized, and when initiatives are taken to represent, to have them more represented, and we always ultimately face the issue of a token representation, which we've seen in South Africa, we've seen also in the US, for example. And I just want your thought on the need maybe to go further and to look into not just having a woman, but actually having women who represent the various shapes of the various experiences. Because I come from an organization where, for example, we want diversity, so we recruit people from around the world, except we sit around the table and then we realize, oh, we just went to the same university. So we all went to Harvard. I may come from Africa, you may come from India, and the other guy from Latin America. That's quickly we realize we actually don't have diverse views. What we have is Western, educated, trained views. So my insatisfaction comes with the fact that when I hear have more women, have more African people, Indian in certain place, I still feel like it's not quite there. I mean, last point, Obama was elected a few years ago, and many said, we've solved it. America's fine. America wasn't fine, as we know now. So that's my question. Thank you.
So that brings us into very complex debates about intersectionality, how as a woman of color, you face a very different set of experiences. As a woman growing up in poverty, you face very different circumstances. And that can, yes, it can get very complicated to capture all of those with one sweeping measure. And honestly, I'd be happy to hear if any of you has a solution to that.
I'll put a little rougher edge on it. If I understand the question right, it sounds like we're even confronted with bias in defining diversity itself. Any thoughts from the panel or the audience on that issue and how to possibly get around it? It's a challenging question the gentleman presented. I'll see if anyone wants to respond here, and then we'll go to you, Samir.
I think that's absolutely true. I think we're oblivious to some of the diversity issues we are actually facing because the people who we were talking to here are mostly educated people, the people who shape algorithms are mostly those who went to university, who have a good educative background. what we need to think about, and I think that's really key. The Guardian published a series this week on how poor and illiterate people actually are discriminated by the use of algorithms per se. So digital by default is something we are sometimes oblivious to, which creates bias and discrimination. So we need to think of where do we need the human factor in addition to algorithms, or as I think Abeba put it quite well, do we need AI at all?
This is kind of a trap because the people who are running the world, building algorithms, deciding what qualifies as legitimate knowledge, what's acceptable, are necessarily educated. In order to be at a position of power to say what is good, what's acceptable, what's good knowledge, you necessarily have to be educated. So by definition, it makes it impossible. It rules out all sorts of other types of knowledge. You know, knowledge that can be expressed through music, dance, knowledge of, intuitive knowledge. People in I don't know, I'll give an example from my country, Ethiopia. In the Somali desert, they know how to survive. They can do so many things that a lot of us here can't do. But that kind of survival knowledge is not seen as legitimate knowledge, so it's kind of discarded. So it's a kind of cyclic dead-end loop that I don't know how we can get out. But going back to representations, a lot of us, even here in the panel, think of, are women interested to get into tech? Are women capable of this? Can women, code? Can they be a good computer scientist? So have you noticed everything is can they? The onus is on them. How about asking, what should my university do to accommodate, to make the environment more suitable, to welcome women? Not only welcome women, it's easy to get students. My university, in my department in computer science, I think there is 17 or 18% undergrad female students. That's really bad. But we don't ask, how do we get women into computer science? So we should ask, how do we get them? What should we do? But also, what should we do to keep them? Getting them might be easy, but you have to make the culture, you have to change the structure, you have to change the mentality in order to make it safe and easy and friendly for women. So so my point is, instead of putting the onus on women themselves, maybe think, more broadly and think about what other universities, institutes can do for women.
There's just one last terminology bit I'd add to that, which is whenever we talk about diversity in relationship with bias, which was what we're talking about, there's something called as feature volitionality, which essentially means that if I'm being represented, like if somebody's creating my demographic profile, or like other things about me which would become input features to a machine learning model, then there are things about me which I can change. I can change my IQ in some sense, my education levels, what I've done in life. I cannot change that I'm an Indian. I cannot change that I'm a woman. So features that are not volitional, features that an individual cannot change, I think add more to the diversity conversation as far as bias is concerned as compared to others. And I think that then ties to that diversity then becomes a very context-specific topic. What is this model trying to do? And like looking at the bigger picture.
So something we started addressing with the only educated people get to be here in this room is access. Access is another important issue within this era that we haven't really tackled in this panel. And an interesting example is from one of my colleagues' conversations with an attendee of sci-fi. this individual is blind. And he was bringing up a set of issues that we as sighted people don't even think of when it comes to access to tech. Issues like our computers are made for sighted people, sidewalks are made for sighted people. So yes, there's a whole other constellation of issues related to access that we do need to tackle as well.
Before I give it to Hanan, we had a fintech discussion at lunch today, and there was a wonderful intervention on that exact same point of accessibility of fintech tools in the new marketplace.
Yeah, I just want to, I actually forgot, but yeah, I wanted to say that a very important thing to do is defining bias, okay? So we cannot keep on saying, yeah, this is bias, this is bias. If 10 women apply to a job that are incompetent and one man applied to the same job and he has the skills, if the algorithm chooses the man, it's not bias, okay? So it is very, very important to tackle a problem, to define the problem. And I think the first thing to do is to sit and say, this is bias, this is what we want an algorithm to do, and this is like the consciousness as a human being plus machines we want to arrive at. So we should stop like just going with the wave and say, yeah, this is not good. An algorithm like discriminated against black people, like a face recognition that could not recognize a black man. Oh, the algorithm is really bad. No, it's not bad. It's just like black people are harder to recognize from a technical point of view. Very simple. Let's work on that. Okay? So really try to understand the real problem, and we should really stop saying, yeah, this is bias, this is discrimination. We have to tackle the real problems and not like just to, I don't know. That's my point.
Okay, can I respond to that? So a computer program not recognizing black people's face is absolutely biased. It's biased.
It is biased, but I mean, bias is...
Can I finish first?
Yeah.
It's biased because face is defined mainly by white people to recognize white faces. So bias comes down to who defines bias. If you think the standard or the norm is white face and you rule out black faces as not faces, of course that's bias. That's discrimination.
No,
that's unfairness.
I'm not saying that. No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that it is very important problem. So instead of like just saying, yeah, this is discrimination, being really hard judgmental, we should tackle the real problem, which is there is a technical problem.
So
we did not arrive at a point where it is technically possible to recognize like equally black and white faces, and so we just delete the algorithm from industry. We don't have to like use that. So until we arrive at a mature technicality for this particular algorithm, then we put it on the in the market. This is what I'm saying, just to try to be fair, also in like really saying what is
defines fair? Who defines fair?
This is what I'm saying.
Who defines bias?
It is very important to define bias, to sit on the table.
One at a time.
Why are you like, what did I say?
No,
Who defines bias?
Let
me hear from each of you. Who defines bias?
Multidisciplinary team of several points of view, diverse team with policymakers, with illiterate people, everybody you want, representative samples of society, of people living in a certain society, are people who can sit together and say, this is what we want to define bias as.
Excellent point. Excellent point. I wish that was the reality. I wish a multidisciplinary group of people defined bias. I wish the tech industry, computer science, wasn't a homogeneous group consisting of white males. I wish what you said was true, but that's not true. Look at the data. A lot of these tech developments, a lot of even the academic disciplines are homogeneous group run by same people, defining what's bias, defining what's unfairness, defining what's discrimination. And how you catch bias and discrimination comes down to how you define those terms.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying. I mean, we have a problem here, and that's why we are debating.
So if a white man
right?
Let's hear from Eileen as well.
Well, I think both is true, but I think we need to find solutions for the future. So I think that actually it depends on each use case. So it depends on use case, and the use case then must be determined by a team that is as multidisciplinary as possible. However, the outcome then might still be biased because we didn't think of something, but then it needs to be tried and redone. So that's
Exactly, like we can iterate. I mean, what you are saying is totally true. I'm not saying the inverse. I'm just saying that things should be done in a proper way.
I'm going to have to exercise moderator's prerogative because we're coming up close on time. This is fascinating, and again, I hope it continues in the evening. I'm going to take... Oh, we have one question and then a comment from Samir, and then we're going to give the panelists each a last word. So please stay with us for a couple more minutes. Can we get the question from that side of the room, please?
Yeah, I'm Ashok again. I spoke in the fintech discussion as well. So artificial intelligence, I'm a direct consumer of artificial intelligence. I use Siri, I use Alexa, and I use Google instance. Google assistants. So my innocent sort of or inquisitive question is, how would I treat this? Do I treat these voice response systems as human, as something that does not take the pain, in the sense like I need to understand the fact that like how do we treat it? How do you treat there is a device which has been skilled to meet my needs, but I don't know how to treat it. In other words, I've been given data. As since morning we are speaking about data, how our data is getting treated, but we don't know the machine's learning data. How are we treating the data that we get? That's the first question. And the second question that I have is, so we are speaking about bias. So bias is the slightest part of the problem. When the machine learning does things on its own, the bigger question is what is true and what is not true, and who decides it? That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Samir, can we have your question as well, then we'll go to the panel?
Yeah, so I have a comment, like you mentioned, and this again, I don't think there are answers to this, but I am increasingly convinced, and I have an engineering background. I started my life as someone who used to run gas turbines and SCADA systems. And for us, that was the modern way of running things at that time. But I'm increasingly convinced that the bias question is not going to be solved by scientists alone. I think it is, we need a golden age of social sciences if we are going to keep up with the innovation space that we are today having to grapple with. And I don't think enough investment is being made because it's not sexy enough. There are no markets who buy papers. You know, they give you $500 honorariums for writing a paper. They don't give you $1 billion to create new frameworks for society. So I think one of the ideas that I just want to throw out is that perhaps it's time for all tech companies to be investing in social sciences, like they invest in tech for development or tech for SDGs. I think unless you have a golden age or a renaissance around how we configure society and think of societies of the future, biases will always be biased. So that's my longer 20-year view. The shorter answer to your question is, I think on this, and not because she's my colleague, but I pitch my flag next to the big hall that Trisha has framed, the big arena she has framed. I like the idea of unlevel playing fields because level playing fields will lead to the same outcome. So you have to have unlevel playing fields so that others can catch up. Unlevel it in the right direction, not in the wrong direction. It could go terribly wrong. So we have to be very careful as we try to fix biases, because guess what? Many forces have done many battles and patriarchy has still prevailed. So we must be very careful that this time around we don't strengthen that impulse and tendency. You know, we have seen organizations like religion and communities and cities and nation states and other constitutions and documents, and you will see this survive. So I think we have to rethink how we bias this. We don't want to be skewing it further. And the second point is that, as Ashok mentioned right now, I think the question of the future is not how do we fix the bias. My question, what worries me, is that before we have discovered this answer, the machines will decide that they want to fix the bias. And how will that look like? So before, human intervention, if you don't get it right, human intervention is going to last for 5 to 7 to 8 years. And thereafter, machines will decide what is biased, what is right, what is wrong, and what is ethical and moral. And then, who do we speak to? As Ashok asked, how do I treat the machine that is treating me? I am the fodder, and I am what they will be working with, not the other way around. Sorry, it was a long comment.
No, this is good. We're going to let each of our panelists address a couple of these topics. I have 4 concepts I heard from the floor. We have the question, how do we treat the machines? How do we identify truth? The role of social sciences, and when do we transition to the machines actually operating in the ethical space, not just humans? As we go down the line, I'm going to invite you to speak to any or all of those. Please do be mindful of the time. And I'm going to implore each of you to end on a note of advice or encouragement to younger women who may be interested in the field of AI. This is a unique opportunity to have very successful, brilliant women in the field that is characteristically and historically dominated by men. So please address any of those questions you like, and end with a word of encouragement to your future successors. You can go in whatever order you choose.
So the question about how we should treat the machines that are integrated into our daily lives, again, ties into a very complex philosophical debate about our kind of codependence with the devices that we use. Because I studied this when I was still working on like philosophy and social science, which is many years ago. In essence, we are already cyborgs. We externalize many sections of our memory to our phones and our devices. Nobody remembers phone numbers anymore. Nobody keeps track of people's birthdays anymore. This is information we have outsourced to the technology that we're using, which doesn't quite, again, link to bias, but this is, again, actually a very interesting constellation of issues. On women in tech, in my experience, what I feel would really help in this field is women who are already in the field or in positions of power and leadership, helping uplift other women. And I think that is a positive first step we can take. If somebody is messaging you on LinkedIn, help them out. Just something as simple as that.
I'd like to touch upon 2 of those things as my closing remarks. Ashok, first to your point, how you should treat these machines, I'd say very carefully. Everything they say, take it with a grain of salt. It's an algorithm. I wish it was human. I wish it had sentiments, emotions. They're being built by data scientists who sit in a room. They don't have a lot of context. They haven't met a lot of people. Treat them very, very carefully. Machine learning has a long way to go. So bear with us. And I'm saying this from perspective of being a data scientist. Bear with us. We're trying our best. For future data scientists, women in the room, people who want to work in this field, be thoughtful. Be thoughtful about the tech you're trying to build. I heard this as golden rule of life, and it goes along the lines of treat your data in the same way as you would like your data to be treated. And I think people in the room, I want them to appreciate this at multiple levels. So if you are working on top of data sets, if you are building models which will be deployed in the real world, be thoughtful, think about the impact of the tech you're creating.
So I'll start with how do we treat these machines, and then I'll move on to the next question. So how should we treat these machines? So first of all, we should absolutely not treat them as something entirely separate of the humans themselves. We build machines. We individuals, albeit with corporate interests, with financial investments, but there is there is human, always. There is a human in the loop. There is no totally autonomous machine. There is no absolutely independent machine that operates and exists independent of humans. So we should treat machines as extensions of ourselves, that if used properly, that should help life easier, make life smooth. So we should treat machines as, with people behind them, when things go wrong, as something that the people behind them need to be accountable for. So moving on to the next question, my advice to women in tech. So we women, and as Trisha mentioned earlier, I love the idea of intersectionality. It's the hierarchy of oppression varies. I don't face the same barrier as a white woman. I know my students, they don't treat me like they treat other lecturers. So it's a different level of problems. So we are constantly, with all the little clues and nuances, we are told we don't belong. We are told we are not as clever. We are not told literally, but given indications of we are less smart. All these constant indications. But my advice is be confident in yourself. Try to know that, I work with a lot of diverse groups, men and women, and I'm on my 4th year of a PhD, so I know a lot of PhD students of all sorts of colors. And I can tell you that the women I know are, because they are constantly facing barriers, and because they have to overcome so many obstacles, they are smarter, they are tougher than the men. So my advice is walk with the confidence of a white woman, as if a white man, as if he belonged in there. Own it. Go for it.
Yeah, I just want to comment. The question was: should we be working with a social scientist? With social scientists, like this. Yeah, this is what I was saying from the beginning. Multidisciplinary team. I said it several times. It is very important, the collaboration between social scientists, psychologists as well, and computer scientists, AI experts, etc. So yeah, the problem is not just a computer science problem, it is a social problem, and that's why we should address it from that perspective at the same time. And my advice to women, yeah, I agree about the self-confidence issue. Because of the biases and prejudice of society and the way women are raised when they are young, women are less confident in themselves. Women are told from a young age that you need to be protected and don't go there, and you are always, someone is gonna hurt you and you should be protected by a man. And so, consequently, women are less confident in themselves. They are less risk takers. They don't jump compared to a man. And my advice to women is just to be confident in yourself and just jump, because if you jump, you can arrive to places that you have never imagined. So it's very important to be a very strong person, have a very strong personality, have faith in yourself, trust what you want, and just go for it. Because if you want something, the universe will respond to you, and this is what happened in my case. So that's it.
Just to add to that, I think nearly everything has been said already. Social scientists in tech, definitely, absolutely. I think that's been said, and it's something for those who are not very good at math like I was. I tried hard. I did quite okay in the end, but being a woman, there are women who try and who still won't code. So that's me, but I'm a social scientist, I'm a lawyer, so social sciences, and we have something to give to that process too, and I think that's a very important topic. As for women in tech or women in science generally, absolutely, and I think it's not just about being strong yourself. It is a lot to do about being brought up strong by your parents, and actually also bringing up your sons to in that mindset. So that makes them strong too. So strong kids, strong parents. I think that's one of the things we must also focus on, not only the women themselves, or the girls themselves. So how we treat machines or how machines treat us. I sincerely hope that we will never arrive at a point when machines will detect our bias without us noticing. So that really speaks for social sciences and human intervention. And we really when creating algorithmic systems, we really need to think about what are they supposed to do, and what is this going to do with us. So that's the starting point, again, of our discussion, I think.
All right, great points to conclude on. I'd like to thank all of you for sharing your evening with us. And I hope you've learned and enjoyed, and I welcome you to join me in thanking our wonderful panel for a great discussion.